The first episode of The Sopranos was released on January 10th, 1999, marking the beginning of what many consider to be the third golden age of television. The show seamlessly blends its serious crime drama narrative with black comedy undertones. This unique style, in combination with it being creator-driven and helmed by a tragic anti-hero protagonist, ushered in a new wave of serial narratives, paving the way for the next 2 decades of television, dominated by TV giants such as The Wire, Lost, Grey's Anatomy, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, House of Cards, and Better Call Saul. The Sopranos ran for nearly 8 years, 6 seasons, and 86 episodes, winning 21 Primetime Emmy Awards with a whopping 111 nominations. However, in this video, I will just be focusing on its initial season. Hi, and welcome to Television Tuesday, the show where we watch TV and tell you all about it. I'm your host, Dalton, and today I'm going to be talking Season 1 of The Sopranos. Just to get into the main cast of the show, we have James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, Edie Falco as Carmela Soprano, Jamie Lynn Sigler as Meadow Soprano, Robert Eiler as AJ Soprano, Nancy Marchand as Livia Soprano, Dominic Chianese as Junior Soprano, Lorraine Bracco as Jennifer Melfi, Michael Imperioli as Christopher Moltisanti, Tony Sirico as Paulie Gualtieri, Stephen Van Zandt as Silvio Dante, John Ventimiglia as Artie Bucco, and John Hurd as Detective Vin Makazian. Now, Sopranos Season 1 released 25 years ago, and this is when seasons of television typically had more episodes than they do today. So if I'm going to get through 13 episodes, I better get chugging. Just to get into Episode 1, the pilot, we start off the episode in Dr. Melfi's office, and it's Tony's first therapy session. At this point, we know virtually nothing about the character, so it is a very interesting introduction, and I kind of also see it as the audience is experiencing Tony Soprano at the same time that Dr. Melfi is. Another thing about this is just the fact that therapy is explored in this piece of mob media. I've seen The Godfather, Casino, Goodfellas, The Irishman, and maybe a couple other mob movies, so I'm kind of familiar with what we're depicting here, and in none of the other movies that I've just listed has one of the bosses went to therapy. Tony, in this scene, Tony's quirky, compassionate side is shown before his domineering mob side. Some other things that happen in this episode is Tony and Christopher, this guy who's kind of climbing the ranks of the mob, they go and they chase down this guy who owes them money, and it's your first sort of mob scene, but we're still really don't have a serious tone yet. It's still kind of comedic the way they're chasing them around, and then Tony catches up to him in the car and kind of beats him to a bloody pulp, so we're kind of just getting things started. Another notable scene in this episode is the Polish guy coming to the drug deal and Christopher just blowing his brains out whenever he turns his back to, snort some of the blow. That was unexpected, but again, just these very unexpected, but also just, edgy displays of mob violence in this first episode really does suck you in. Continuing on mob violence, we have Hesh and Pussy threatening the same guy that Tony hunts down at the beginning of the episode, and they take him to this bridge overlooking a waterfall, and they're pretty much threatening to throw him off if he can't come up with the money. Near the end of the episode, you have this sort of heartfelt scene between Tony and Meadow, where he's talking about how, his ancestors or his great-grandfather, I think it was his great-grandfather and his great-uncle came over from Italy, and they helped build this really nice chapel, and it's got all the paintings on the ceiling, the whole Catholic works, and it looks really nice. And the main plot point that gets introduced in the first episode is that Tony's Uncle Junior, he's put a hit out on Big Pussy, who's another member of the mob, not to be confused with Pussy Bumpin' Saro. And because of what this would do to Artie Bucco's restaurant, because he's friends with Tony, and again, it's just kind of on that theme of, I really didn't expect him to go this far this soon, but here we are just torching this dude's restaurant. One of the focal points of the therapy session is Tony having these ducks in his pool. There was a family of ducks, they went and nested in his pool and he tended to them. He's just kind of fixated on it the whole time, and it makes him sad that they left, and they're trying to figure out what it means. And ultimately, Dr. Melfi helps him come to the conclusion that he's afraid of losing his family, which is kind of an obvious realization with the family and the family of ducks, and also just the relationships that we're establishing and the importance that we've put on them. We get into episode 2, 46 long, and we get into some other kind of mob money-making activities. Christopher, the up-and-coming mob guy, and Brendan, they're hitting these trucks, and it's going good for a while, and then Brendan ends up killing one of the drivers. Come to find out, these guys were paying Tony's Uncle Junior for protection, so it ends up causing some beef. There's also this side plot where Pussy and Polly are tracking down a stolen Saturn, which was AJ's science teacher's car. They ended up tracking down this gay couple who boosted the car, and then they end up having them steal another Saturn and get the plate back, and then returning it to the teacher. The most interesting scenes in this show are whenever the mob story and the family drama story kind of come together, and you have fun scenes like this. And you also just have Tony's deplorable mother going around and just kind of being old and miserable. She starts a fire in her own home, and you just don't even want to hear the woman talk, really. I'm kind of with Tony and like the growing disdain that he has for his mother as the season progresses. The primary reason that Tony goes to therapy is because he passes out, and in this second episode we see him pass out again. Getting into episode 3, Denial, Anger, Acceptance. We have Chris's mock execution. Now, I'm thinking episode 3, are we really killing off a character who I think is a main, running cast member of the season of the show this quickly? And thankfully, no, Christopher's okay. But these Russian mobsters take him out to this dock, and it seems like they're gonna kill him because of him and Brendan boosting the trucks, but they just let him go. There's also just this introduction of normal people seeking the mob's help in their, domestic matters. You have this Jewish man who's kind of being extorted by his son-in-law. He's taken over this motel that's run by the family, and he makes a deal with Tony, and a couple of the mob guys go and rough him up a little bit, and they're trying to get him to adhere, to one of the old guys' policies and have him, gain some more control back of this motel, but he's not budging. The older guy ends up getting tired of it, and he calls Tony a golem, and just things kind of get violent towards the end. Something big happens in episode 3. We have boss Jackie Aprile being hospitalized with stomach cancer. And he is essentially the acting boss of the mob at this time. It foreshadows a potential power struggle, just because things aren't looking too good whenever you get diagnosed with stomach cancer. Something else that happens, which just kind of catches you off guard, is Christopher sells speed to Meadow in the same episode where he thinks he's getting taken out to the Meadowlands and executed. It just doesn't really make any sense to me. I guess maybe it kind of ties into this theme of family, and he's going to risk it anyways, even though, there's the chance that Tony could find out, but I thought it was a fun plot point. And it's this that allows Meadow to study and also practice for the recital that Tony ends up crying at the end of the episode. So it was a fun little full circle moment there. As we have Meadow solo in the background of this scene, we cut to Brendan, the guy who was helping Christopher rob these trucks. We have the right-hand man to Junior Soprano, Mikey Palmisi, enter the room, and he just shoots Brendan square between the eyes, and that's the end of him. Really shocking, but also kind of satisfying end of the episode. Do kind of feel bad for Brendan though, but he was kind of being an idiot, and you can't do that whenever you're involved with the mob. Getting into episode 4, Meadowlands, we have Dr. Melfi tell Tony that in response to Tony kind of complaining about his mother and his uncle, these kind of senior figures in his life, Dr. Melfi tells Tony to essentially make the elderly people feel like they're in control to avoid tension. So that's kind of what he starts doing. So as we see this oncoming power struggle happening because of the potential death of the boss, Tony starts supporting Junior's claim to be the new boss of the crime family. I thought that was really interesting. But again, just because of what we've learned of Tony's character so far, there's kind of always something in it for him. He's always playing some sort of angle, and essentially he's still going to be running the mob behind his back, but just communicating through his men, which you just know that that's going to cause trouble later on. We kind of have the revelation that Tony is attracted to Dr. Melfi. He has this dirty police detective, Vin Makazian, tail her while she's on a date with some guy, and he ends up pulling them over, and he beats the guy up, and he pretty much goes too far. He was really just supposed to surveil them. Ultimately here, the underlying thing is that Tony is now stalking her and just kind of keeping up with her day-to-day activities. He's meeting him by the bay, and talking to the detective and learning just what her daily routine is. And then we get into episode 5, College. And I think whenever I was watching the season, this was probably my favorite episode up to this point. We have Tony taking Meadow on college tours. So they're going on a little trip. And then whenever they get to their lodgings, they see this guy. Tony recognizes him. His name ends up being Fabian Petrulio. And it turns out he's a former soldier of the mob who ended up flipping, and he's been living in witness protection. And Tony's just seen him, and he's locked on to him like a great white. So after this, Tony begins stalking him, and it turns out Petrulio kind of just expects, after Tony sees him, that he's been watching him. He tracks down where Tony's staying. Petrulio actually sees Tony and Meadow going into their little hotel room, and he has the opportunity to kill Tony, but he doesn't, because ultimately there were too many witnesses, but he was also with his daughter. He's found his place of business, and whenever he goes there, Tony just kind of sneaks up on him, and he's got like this sort of, I don't know what exactly he uses, but he chokes him out with like this little piece of wire or something. Yeah, that's whenever Petrulio reveals to Tony that, he had the opportunity to kill him and he didn't, and Tony just tells him that he should have, and he just chokes him to death, and you just kind of see the sheer ruthlessness of Tony Soprano in this scene. And I'll say, I think this might be the first time we see Tony kill somebody. And then you have this iconic scene that I had seen before I even watched Sopranos, and this was...
Are you in the Mafia?
And of course he denies it, they kind of just... He beats around the bush the whole conversation, but it's a lot of fun to see Tony dancing around the subject. Later in the episode, Dr. Melfi calls the house. I don't remember what the reason was, but Carmela answers the phone, and she now knows that Tony's therapist is a woman, because this entire time he's been peddling the idea that his therapist was a man, and now she just knows that Tony lied to her. And I think it kind of pushes us into this next scene, and maybe some of what Carmela's doing. Her and Father Intantola. He is the priest at their church. He's come over to the house, and I think they're baking some pasta, and they're watching, they have a shared love for these rom-com movies, and things almost ramp up into a make-out session, but they stop themselves, and Father Intantola goes and vomits afterwards. Because he's drunk, he stays the night, and then just awkwardly leaves the next day, and it's just, okay. We see that Carmela and Tony, just because of the way Tony acts, maybe just because of the way he feels that he can act because he is this high-ranking member of the mob, they're both comfortable having affairs just because of the state of their relationship. Or at least Carmela's almost there, but they don't give in. We get into episode 6, Pax Soprano, and Tony full-on advances on Melfi. He tries to kiss her, and then you find out that he has her car stolen and repaired, and it's like, okay, Tony, you were going full-on creep mode with your therapist here. Like, you're not even trying to receive help anymore, you're just being weird and trying to fuck her. Like, what's wrong with you? And all the while he's telling Carmela, there's no attraction, I'm not attracted to her. And then we have perhaps one of the coolest scenes in this episode, and this is Junior's ascension to mob boss. So they're all gathered in this fancy room having dinner. Meanwhile, whenever we're going around the room to the different members, it kind of flashes and then it stops and it becomes a black and white photograph. We see that the FBI, it's kind of meant to emulate the FBI taking photos of them. We're cross-cutting this with this pin board. They're taking Jackie's picture down from the boss title and they move Junior's up. And you can just see the whole hierarchy of the mob, and it's like, this is awesome. I love that the FBI just kind of has it all figured out, and they have this active inner workings of the mob that they change depending on who's in power. That's so cool. Then we get into episode 7, Down Neck. We have AJ getting drunk at school, and the principal pretty much tells Tony and Carmela that he may have ADD. The rest of this episode is primarily flashback. Tony is recounting this story to Dr. Melfi, and pretty much Janice, his little sister Janice, always got to go with his father, and he never knows where they're going, but she always got taken somewhere. So this time he decides that he's going to stow away in the trunk of his dad's car, and he does that, and turns out they're going to an amusement park. And he's just kind of like, what the hell? Like, why isn't he taking me here? And he's watching them go in, and a couple moments later, we kind of have this elapsed time, and then we see Tony's father and Uncle Junior. They're being escorted out by the police, and turns out they were doing mob business at the amusement park, fair, whatever it was. So really, Tony wasn't missing out on anything, but it was just a way for his dad to go and do his mob dealings. And then at the end of this episode, we have AJ going to visit Livia. He tells Livia that Tony has been seeing a therapist. And the connotation that's been established so far is that, no one in the mob goes and sees a therapist. If you're seeing a therapist, that means that you're going insane, your mental health's not good, you're ready to, maybe end your own life. You're going to do something reckless, or maybe you're even spilling some of the mob business. Then we get into episode 8, The Legend of Tennessee Multisanti. We have this conversation between Melfi and her ex-husband, and they're arguing over whether she could continue to treat Tony. And I think it's interesting that this is something that's being discussed in her scenes now. The crime family, they get this tip that the FBI is about to come and raid, so they hide and destroy any evidence of their mob activity. And they come, everything's clean as a whistle, they're just hanging out, playing cards, shooting some pool, having drinks. They're just chilling. There's this really interesting scene where Chris starts having these nightmares about this man that he's killed earlier in the season, and he ends up going and digging up his body and relocating it because he's that paranoid of it being found. And another thing with Christopher is he's trying to become a made man. He's associated with Tony's crew right now, but he's not officially part of it. He still has to prove himself. And he's kind of upset that he doesn't have any street cred, and then whenever names are being mentioned in the paper about the FBI raid, that he's not one of them. And it's kind of silly because you would think as a mobster, you don't want your name to be in the press. You don't want to be talked about. But at the same time, they do kind of want these big raps because it just shows how dangerous of a criminal they are. Later in the episode, he goes and he ends up shooting a bakery clerk in the foot. And this is something that he does end up getting in the paper for, and he's just kind of like has this, yes moment. But it's just, again, really silly. Now we get into episode 9, Boca. Carmela overhears Junior's girlfriend talking about his cunnilingus talents. I'm not going to go into details on what cunnilingus is if you don't know, but let's just say that Uncle Junior is really good at he has a certain talent about him. We find out that she ends up talking about it just because, she's kind of bragging on him, bragging about how good it is, and it's just the talk of the town, and they're going out and shooting some golf, and Tony's kind of teasing him about it. He's, giving these subtle hints that he knows, and funnily enough, eating is one of those things that goes along with getting therapy. It's just one of those things that mobsters aren't supposed to do. This one doesn't make as much sense, and I forgot who explains it, but essentially, it's one step away from being gay. Junior finds out that she's told everybody, and he goes, and she's baked this pie for him, and he takes it and just throws it in her face and just kind of rubs it around and breaks up with her. Really funny scene. I don't know why we're seeing Junior's love life, but I do like seeing it amidst all of the mob business because it's funny. Something I should also mention about the relationship, he's always called Junior Uncle Junior, but his girlfriend calls him Corrado in this very, New York sounding accent. It's really funny. And of course, Tony going to therapy gets back to Uncle Junior, and he pretty much starts talking to Mikey Palmisi about it. He suspects Tony of maybe informing his therapist of mob business, and they're like, okay, here's the trouble that we thought would brew. Meanwhile, you have Tony and other members of the mob attending Meadows soccer games, and the team's doing really good. They win a game, and you see them at practice, and you can see that their coach is very involved, very passionate about what they're doing, and he's coaching them well. They pretty much get word that he's going to take a job at a college and skip town. They're not about it because he would be leaving before their championship, and they pretty much want him to stay so that, he can lead the girls to victory. To convince him to stay, they ended up doing a bunch of silly things, One of the attempts is I think it's Silvio. He comes by the coach's house with like this massive flat screen TV, and he's like, yeah, you can have this. We just had it lying around. And he's like, I'm still going to take the job. Like, I've already taken it. There's nothing I can do. And eventually it gets to where they're just intimidating him. They've kidnapped his dog, and hey, I found your dog. He was walking the neighborhood. Must have got out. You have another member of the soccer team, one of Meadow's friends. She ends up slitting her wrists and trying to end her life. Come to find out, Meadow tells Tony and Carmela that this is because she's had sex with the coach. And she is this high school age girl, and she had relations with this middle-aged man, and it's just this disgusting revelation that we have. Tony isn't as maybe disgusted by it in the beginning whenever it first hits him as he should be, but then he's like, okay, no, we gotta do something about this. They're pretty much planning to kill him. But Dr. Melfi's been talking to Tony, and because she knows who he is and what he does, but they don't discuss it directly. He's in waste management. He's a garbage guy. But I think in this episode, some of their therapy had kind of went over, just forgiving people and having leniency and just not always pursuing, the most drastic route. Ultimately, he's talked down by Artie Bucco, who's like, you know what? I know what you're gonna do. I really wanted to kill this guy myself. I know how you feel, but I don't think we should do it. And you should let the police handle it. And, Tony exercises restraint in this episode, and he doesn't do it. He doesn't put out the hit. The coach gets arrested, and that's that. And this is a stepping stone for Tony's character development. It's like, okay, good episode. Now we are to episode 10, A Hit is a Hit. Things are starting to ramp up. We begin with this side plot of Christopher and Adriana. They end up meeting up with this gangster rapper. His name is Massive Genius. Pretty much, Adriana wants to get into music management. She wants to get into producing some records, and if she goes and talks to this guy, he's been producing records. And it turns out that this guy is actually in dispute with Hesh, another member of the mob. And he was a guy who also produced records back in the day, and he'd had some partners that Massive Genius was in connection with. One of his former partner's wives, I believe. He was disputing royalties for some songs they made together, claiming that Hesh stole the money. And they pretty much just agreed to sue each other, which was just kind of funny. You also have this scene of Bruce Cusimano. He's Tony's neighbor. He invites him to play golf. Tony goes out with him and his golf buddies, and the entire time they're just asking him questions about the mob. They're like, so is it really like it is in The Godfather? Or like, have you done it? And Tony's just kind of, uncomfortable with the questions, and he's not giving them direct answers. Because of this, at the end of the episode, Tony brings Cusimano a box filled with sand and pretty much tells him to hold on to it. And this scares him, but he tells Bruce, don't open the box. I'm gonna get it whenever I come back in a week. And turns out the box was just filled with sand, but he wants him to think it's something like dangerous and illegal, and he even takes it to his wife and is like, oh, Tony Soprano told me to keep an eye on this box, and there's just sand inside of it. And it's just another side of just the black comedy that's behind the murders and the crime and the family drama that's going on. Then we get into episode 11, Nobody Knows Anything. Makazian, the police detective, he tells Tony that Pussy is wearing a wire, and Tony's like, no. There's no way, he's one of my most trusted guys. And then he's like, okay, Polly, we've got to test this theory. Polly goes, he gets Pussy, and he's like, hey, we're going on a ride, come with me. And so they go to this bathhouse, and he's pretty much telling Pussy, strip. And he's like, no, I won't do it. He starts listing off all his reasons for why he can't, and he's like, fine, whatever, and Pussy ends up leaving, and it's like, okay. You're not making a very good case for yourself here. Oh, this is Pussy. We really don't want to have to do this. And then later in the episode, Makazian ends up killing himself. He gets caught in a brothel, and it pretty much ruins his life. And so, he kills himself, and it's sad. But we find out that he may have had some ulterior motives and some motivation for wanting to have Pussy killed because it would have benefited him, and so they're like, okay, maybe what he's saying's not true, and he just wanted to have Pussy killed. Later in the episode, Junior finds out that all of his mob captains have put their mothers in the same nursing home that Tony put his mother in, and so it leads him to the conclusion that, okay, all of my guys are meeting behind my back, and he's caught on to what Tony's plan was all along. Ultimately, this is a running theme through the season. He'll visit Tony's mom, they'll talk about mob business just because that was something she was a part of, just because Tony's father was the boss for the longest time. And she ultimately convinces Uncle Junior to put a hit out on Tony. And this is a very shocking moment. Didn't expect this to happen in season 1, and especially not to be motivated from his own mom. She compares him to one of her friend's sons who had a lobotomy and who's just like a sad shell of his former self, and it hurts me to see her talking about Tony like this. Like, he's a bad guy. I've gotten to see that in many instances over the course of this season, but I really feel for him in this moment. Now we get to the next to last episode. Episode 12, Isabella. Pussy has completely disappeared. Nobody can find him, and it's like, okay, this is still very worrying. We need to find our Pussy. Tony has dinner with this young Italian woman, and she's this maid who's staying and watching the Cusimano's house while they're on vacation, and they go out and they're talking, and come to find out, Bruce Cusimano, he returns from his trip, and Tony's talking about the maid, and he's like, yeah, she's a very nice lady, this and that. Turns out there was never a maid, there was never a woman, and he starts talking to Dr. Melfi about this, and she's like, oh, well, I did prescribe you the lithium, it probably caused you to hallucinate. She's kind of interpreting Tony's hallucination, and she's like, Tony ends up having a dream about her later on, and he dreams that, she's his mother back in, their home village in Italy, and she's pretty much just rocking him, cradling him in this little traditional Italian home, and she pretty much determines that this woman that Tony's imagined is his idealized maternal figure. Very interesting developments in therapy this episode. Then we have our first attempt at trying to kill Tony. These dudes, they pull up. It's previously told to us that they're going to use a different crew to do it. And so these two African-American gentlemen pull up. As they're watching Tony go into the coffee shop, Christopher pulls up because he's also been tailing Tony, which is very interesting. But in this instance, him pulling up stops them from being able to do the hit. Tony walks out the back of the place, and it turns out that Dr. Melfi's office is just behind here, so he's been using it as a front to kind of disguise that he's been going to therapy. And so after this hit fails, they try and get him a different day whenever he's going to the newsstand. They kind of have his daily routine at this point. He's walking back to his car. Same dude pulls up, guns blazing, and he shoots Tony's orange juice. He misses. Tony starts, getting in his car. The dude comes up. He's trying to shoot Tony. Tony grabs the gun, and he's trying to get it away from him. And then the other guy comes around to the other window, the passenger side window, and he's trying to get Tony, and he shoots the guy who's trying to help him, carry out the hit, which is kind of hilarious. And then Tony just, mashes the accelerator, and they start taking off down the road, and they probably get a good ways down the street before Tony leaves him in the dust. But it's really funny. You try and kill such a high-ranking member of the mob, and you think you're getting some good guys to do it, and these two goons pull up, and they do a hideous job of it. And at the end of the episode, we have Uncle Junior and Livia going to check on Tony. And this is whenever we first kind of get that Livia might have memory loss conveniently right now after she's convinced Uncle Junior to kill Tony. Yeah. Then we get to the season finale, episode 13, I Dream of Jeannie Cusimano. In this episode, Tony full-on attacks Dr. Melfi. This is after she suggests that Livia may have borderline personality disorder. It's just so funny because we've seen Tony respond to her in such a wide variety of ways. We've seen him be just completely chill and them talk about, some intimate things, like you do with your therapist. And then you've seen him, try to seduce her, and he's been stalking her. And now he just full-on, he's about to attack her. And it's just, Tony, chill. this is right after the hit. He warns her, hey, you need to go into hiding because they think that I might have been telling you mob dealings, so you're not safe. Begrudgingly, she's like, okay. And then we have a scene where Tony has to tell his men about the therapy. He sits them down and, he says it. Then Polly's like, yeah, I went to therapy, so maybe it's not as taboo as we initially thought. And everybody's just like, you talk about like your mother and family drama and stuff, and it's like, yeah, I don't talk about any of our business, no names are ever mentioned. And after this, it's like, all right, Uncle Junior put a head out on me. Let's go kill his men. And then, hallelujah, Livia has a stroke. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I don't like the character. She's deplorable. Later in the episode, Artie Bucco visits her. Because she's kind of been losing her memory at this point, so to speak, she slips up and she says that Tony burned Nuovo Vesuvio, however you say it, Artie Bucco's restaurant. And this is something that happened way back at the beginning of the season. And you're like, I never thought that this information would get out. This is not good. And the next time Tony tries to go see Artie pulls up with a rifle and he's like, did you burn my restaurant? Tony's like, chill. He convinces him that he did not burn it, even though he in fact did. And Tony has gotten off the hook from a second attempted murder, assassination, whatever you want to call it, this season. And it's like, okay, I could see this being a running theme throughout the show, and then maybe one day they'll get him. Who knows? He then talks to the FBI because they're like, hey, Tony, your mother convinced your uncle to put the hit out on you, right? And they play the tape and they're like, hey, the streets aren't safe for you anymore. We realize that, just go ahead and give yourself up and, you can go into witness protection. Tony's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Thanks for this information. It's been very insightful. Then you're like, okay, what's going to happen to Uncle Junior? I'm totally thinking, okay, we're going to have a hit put out on him. Tony has cut off the head of the snake and he is now going to become the boss. But my expectations were subverted. Funnily enough, Junior gets picked up for racketeering charges or some sort of illegal business activity, and he gets picked up and taken to prison. And you're like, okay, so Tony can't kill him? But yeah, no, it's kind of a funny way to just, lock Uncle Junior up and throw away the key on him to bring him out for maybe another season. And then the final scene of this episode is Tony and his family. They go to the new Nuovo Vesuvio, Artie Bucco's new restaurant, because he has a new one now. Tony essentially tells them they're going to remember the little moments that were good, like the family gathered, spending time and having dinner. And we end on this lighthearted note after an episode of murder and butchery and family betrayal, family drama, and, this power struggle. But all the humor that also goes along with such powerful storytelling. I really don't have much to say about the filmmaking aspects of The Sopranos. The cinematography's beautiful, the music choices, there's some popular music scattered throughout that definitely gives the show some forward momentum and some punch whenever it, to heighten certain scenes. This probably isn't something they were thinking about while they were making the show, or it wasn't intended for them, but it is sort of a period piece now. We are 25 years removed from this first season in 2024, and yeah, no, it's funny to see 1999, we're about to turn the year on the millennium, and the year is going to become 2000. Interesting to see, the style and just kind of the period right before the internet. The show follows a wide range of characters, but everyone's acting is phenomenal. I believe all of it. I love these New Jersey mobster, New England sort of personalities. They're a lot of fun to watch on screen. Now, all that's left to do is score season 1 of The Sopranos. And ultimately, I think I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. One thing I will say is I did have trouble watching the show initially. It took me maybe 2 or 3 times of watching the pilot and then maybe the first 2 or 3 episodes to really get into the show. But once you, make that investment and watch the rest of the season and you see how all of the little storytelling moments pay off at the end of the season and episodes leading up to it, you're like, oh, this is great storytelling. But maybe just 1 point deducted because it is a little slow in the beginning, in spite of some really exciting things happening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Television Tuesday. If you did, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. We also have more episodes of Television Tuesday. We've reviewed shows like Invincible, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, Tires, Young Justice. We also have our sister show, Studio Cinema Saturday, where we've talked about films like Quiet Place Day 1, X-Men Origins Wolverine, Maxine, Deadpool and Wolverine. Yeah, go give those videos a watch, show them some love. We also have Studio 24 Horror Month on the way. We're dropping 4 horror short films on 4 Saturdays in October, leading to a crescendo on Halloween with a 40-minute film, so stay tuned for that. And as always, we'll see you at the next watch.